My daddy is a hero, he helps me grow up strong. A little girl's voice fills the air, sweet and full of love. She's looking up at him, her eyes shining with admiration. To her, he is everything. The strongest. The kindest. The one person in the world she trusts more than anyone. My daddy is a hero. I know he'll never let me down. She smiles, unaware that the very man she sings about will soon take everything from her, her mother, her little sister, and, in the end, her own life. August 13, 2018. A pregnant woman arrives home before dawn, exhausted from travel, stepping into a house she doesn't realize will become her tomb. Upstairs, two little girls sleep soundly, dreaming of the morning ahead. They have no idea that, within hours, they'll wake up to a nightmare they can't escape. Chris Watts. A husband. A father. A man who was supposed to protect his family. Instead, he made a decision that would leave an entire nation in disbelief. He didn't just take their lives, he made them suffer. He let them wake up, let them cry, let them beg. He made them watch. And when it was over, he acted like nothing happened. He smiled for the cameras, played the part of a grieving husband, and went about his day as if he hadn't destroyed everything. But the truth was coming. The lies were unraveling. And soon, the world would learn just how far he was willing to go to erase his family. This is the story of Chris Watts. A man who was supposed to be a hero, but became something else entirely. Chris and Shanann Watts seemed like an ordinary American couple, living the kind of life many people strive for. From the outside, they had it all, a loving marriage, two beautiful daughters, and a home in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Frederick, Colorado. But as we look closer, we begin to see the pieces of a far more complicated story. Chris Watts was born in North Carolina in 1985. By all accounts, he was quiet, reserved, and hardworking. He had a passion for cars and mechanics, skills that later helped him land a steady job in the oil industry. Shanann Watts, born in 1984, was the opposite, outspoken, energetic, and social. When they met, she was recovering from a painful divorce and battling health challenges, including lupus. Chris seemed like the perfect partner, supportive, patient, and kind. They married in 2012, and soon after, Shanann announced they were expecting their first child. Bella Marie Watts was born on December 17, 2013. She was gentle, loving, and deeply attached to her parents, especially her father. A little over a year later, on July 17, 2015, their second daughter, Celeste Catherine, or Cece, arrived. Unlike her older sister, Cece was full of energy, wild, fearless, and always on the move. The two girls were inseparable, and their home was filled with the sounds of laughter and childhood innocence. On the surface, the Watts family was thriving. Shanann worked hard to provide for her children, balancing her role as a mother with her career in health and wellness. She became a brand ambassador for Thrive, a nutrition and lifestyle company, sharing her experiences on social media. Her Facebook was filled with videos of her daughters playing, birthday celebrations, and moments of affection between her and Chris. She spoke often about how lucky she felt to have such a supportive husband, calling him the best thing that ever happened to her. But social media tells only part of the story. Beneath the smiling photos and loving posts, there were struggles. Financially, the Watts family was in trouble. In 2015, they filed for bankruptcy, citing over $70,000 in debt, most of it from credit cards and medical expenses. Despite their financial difficulties, they purchased a 5-bedroom home in Frederick, Colorado, a significant investment that added pressure to their already strained budget. Then, there were the personal struggles. Shanann's health issues often left her exhausted, and with Chris working long hours in the oil industry, the weight of managing the household fell largely on her. She was strong-willed, used to taking charge, and had high expectations, something Chris, a more passive personality, sometimes struggled with. To friends and family, they were a typical married couple with ups and downs, but no one could have predicted what was about to happen. No one could have imagined that, while Shanann was working tirelessly to hold her family together, Chris was making decisions that would tear them apart forever. By the summer of 2018, cracks in the Watts marriage were widening. Shanann, pregnant with their third child, a son they planned to name Nico, was eager to rebuild their relationship. She sensed something was off with Chris. He had grown distant, uninterested, and emotionally detached. For years, Shanann had taken the lead in their relationship. She planned the vacations, handled the finances, and made most of the big decisions. But now, Chris wasn't just withdrawing, he was changing. He started working out more, paying extra attention to his appearance, and suddenly seemed overly protective of his phone. Shanann suspected stress, maybe even depression. What she didn't know was that Chris had met someone else. In early July 2018, Chris began an affair with Nicole Kessinger, a geologist working at Anadarko Petroleum, the same company where he was employed. What started as a flirtation quickly became something much deeper. Nicole later told investigators that Chris claimed he was in a loveless marriage, that he and Shanann were separating. She believed she was falling for a man who was ready to start a new life. Chris embraced this new role. With Nicole, he wasn't the passive, quiet husband, he was exciting, adventurous, a man rediscovering himself. They went on dates, spent nights together, and exchanged thousands of messages, many of which he deleted. He promised her they had a future. But there was a problem, Shanann. She wasn't going to let their marriage end without a fight. While visiting family in North Carolina with the girls, Shanann repeatedly texted Chris, desperate to understand why he had become so cold. "You barely touched me last night," she wrote. "If you're done, just tell me." But Chris avoided confrontation, giving vague reassurances. When she returned to Colorado in early August, she was determined to save their marriage. She made plans for a weekend getaway, hoping to rekindle their connection. But Chris had already checked out. He was spending his nights with Nicole, whispering promises of a future without his wife and children. A week later, Shanann left for a business trip to Arizona. She had no idea it would be the last time she would ever see her daughters alive. August 13, 2018. Shanann arrived home at 1:48 a.m., dropped off by her friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson. She was exhausted from the trip, walking into a dark house where her husband and daughters were supposed to be asleep. What happened next remains one of the most horrifying betrayals imaginable. Hours later, at 8:30 a.m., Nicole grew concerned. Shanann had a scheduled OB/GYN appointment, but she wasn't answering calls or texts. She had been sick during the trip, and now, after missing an appointment she never would have skipped, Nicole felt something was wrong. She drove to the Watts house and knocked. No answer. She rang the doorbell. Still nothing. But Shanann's car was in the garage, her shoes, ones she always wore, still inside. By 12:10 p.m., Nicole called Chris, demanding answers. His response was strangely detached. He claimed Shanann had taken the girls on a playdate. Nicole didn't believe him. She called the police. At 1:40 p.m., Officer Coonrod arrived. Chris soon followed, acting confused and nervous. He allowed the officer inside, where everything looked normal, too normal. Shanann's purse, phone, and medication were still there. The girls' beds were neatly made. But the house was eerily silent. As police investigated, Chris stood on the porch, swaying slightly, arms crossed. When reporters showed up, he faced the cameras, pleading for his family's safe return. "Shanann. Bella. Cece, if you're out there, please, just come back." His voice wavered, but his eyes stayed empty. Something wasn't right. And investigators knew it. The search for Shanann, Bella, and Cece intensified. Police brought in cadaver dogs, searched the neighborhood, and interviewed friends and family. Meanwhile, Chris's behavior only made detectives more suspicious. He showed little genuine concern, barely asking questions about the investigation. Instead, he seemed more focused on his phone, exchanging messages with Nicole Kessinger, messages he would later delete. On August 15, investigators asked Chris to take a polygraph test. He agreed. What he didn't realize was that he was about to make a crucial mistake. FBI agent Tammy Lee administered the test. She asked simple, direct questions. Do you know where Shanann is? Did you physically harm Shanann? Are you lying about the last time you saw them? Each answer brought the same result, deception. Chris failed the test miserably. Detectives confronted him, pushing harder. His story started to shift. First, he suggested that Shanann had left on her own. Then, he implied she might have hurt the children. But none of it made sense. Hours later, Chris finally broke. But the truth he told wasn't the whole truth. It was a version of reality designed to make him seem like the victim. In a chilling confession, Chris claimed that he and Shanann had argued that morning. He told her he wanted to separate. He said she became upset, and in a fit of rage, she strangled their daughters. In response, he snapped, killing her in a moment of blind fury. It was a lie. A desperate, cowardly attempt to shift the blame. But investigators weren't buying it. They knew Chris Watts had murdered his entire family. What they didn't yet know was how truly horrifying his actions had been. The world was about to learn that Chris Watts didn't just kill his daughters. He killed them twice. The world had watched Chris Watts stand on his porch, begging for his family's return. Now, just 2 days later, those same eyes were on him for a different reason. August 15, 2018, Chris Watts sat in an interrogation room at the Frederick Police Department, the walls closing in. He had failed his polygraph test. His story had crumbled under scrutiny. And now, detectives weren't giving him any more room to run. Across from him sat Agent Tammy Lee and Detective Graham Coder, their voices steady but unrelenting. Chris, there's only one reason you would fail a polygraph that badly, Tammy told him. You already know what happened to Shanann and the girls. You're lying to us. Chris folded his arms, his breathing shallow. He looked trapped. Chris, if you did something, you need to own up to it, Graham pressed. For hours, Chris denied, deflected, insisted that Shanann had taken the girls and left. But the weight of his lies was becoming too much. He had run out of excuses. He had run out of time. Detectives made one final move. They brought in Chris's father, Ronnie Watts. Chris had always sought his father's approval. He had been a quiet, obedient child, never the type to get in trouble. And now, here he was, sitting across from his dad in an interrogation room, a murderer with nowhere to hide. His voice was barely above a whisper. Dad. I did it. Ronnie leaned in, confused, his hands trembling. What do you mean? Chris exhaled shakily. He couldn't admit the full truth. He couldn't bring himself to say that he had murdered his daughters. So he spun a new lie. Shanann, she hurt them, Dad. She killed the girls. And I lost it. I had to stop her. It was the ultimate betrayal. Blaming his pregnant wife, the mother of his children, for a crime she never committed. But for a brief moment, it gave Chris what he needed, the illusion of justification. The confession was enough. Authorities had heard enough. By the afternoon of August 15, Chris Watts was arrested for the murders of Shanann Watts, Bella Watts, and Celeste Watts. But investigators weren't finished. They needed to find their bodies. The truth about what happened to Shanann, Bella, and Cece lay hidden miles away, in a desolate stretch of Weld County, Colorado. Chris had led authorities to the oil field where he worked, a quiet, isolated place, far from prying eyes. For years, this land had been a worksite, a place where men clocked in and out, drilling into the earth for profit. Now, it was something else entirely. A crime scene. At the site, investigators made a devastating discovery. Shanann's body was buried in a shallow grave, barely beneath the surface. She had been wrapped in a sheet, one from the Watts' own bed. The soil above her had been hastily disturbed, as if Chris had been too panicked, too desperate, to bury her properly. But the worst was yet to come. Nearby stood two massive oil tanks, towering over the land. It was here that Chris had hidden his daughters. For 4 days, Bella and Cece's small bodies had been submerged in crude oil. Investigators had to drain the tanks carefully, knowing that any mistake could compromise the evidence. When they finally reached the children, their tiny forms were unrecognizable. The oil had preserved them and destroyed them at the same time. They were pulled from the tanks, wrapped in trash bags, the same ones Chris had used to suffocate them. He had thrown them away like garbage. But the autopsies would reveal something far worse. As forensic pathologists examined the bodies of Bella and Cece Watts, the true horror of their final moments came to light. Chris Watts had not simply murdered his daughters. He had murdered them twice. The autopsy findings were clear. When Chris first smothered Bella and Cece in their home, they lost consciousness, but they didn't die immediately. Their small bodies had still been clinging to life as he loaded them into his truck. For over an hour, Chris drove to the oil field, his daughters lying side by side on the floor of the truck, barely breathing, their tiny chests rising and falling, fighting for air. Bella was awake. She knew. At some point, she must have turned to Cece, calling her name, trying to wake her up. Then, in those final moments, as Chris prepared to finish what he started, Bella looked up at her father, the man she had once sung about, calling him her hero. "Daddy, no." Her last words. A plea for her life. The autopsy revealed that Bella fought back. Unlike Cece, whose injuries suggested she was already unconscious when he placed his hands around her neck, Bella had defensive wounds, small cuts on her frenulum, the soft tissue inside the upper lip. She had struggled against the suffocation, biting her tongue in the process. She had tried to stop him. But Chris Watts was beyond mercy. With calculated precision, he pressed his hands over his daughter's mouth and nose, waiting, watching, until her tiny body stopped moving. Then, with the same coldness, he carried her lifeless form to the oil tank and shoved her through the narrow 8-inch hatch. For 2 days, Chris continued to play the role of a grieving husband and father. He gave interviews, sent texts pretending to be concerned, even called his daughter's school to unenroll her, as if erasing them from existence would make it all go away. But the truth was out. The world now knew the extent of his evil. Chris Watts was a killer. Not just of his wife. Not just of his unborn son. But of 2 innocent little girls who had loved him more than anything in the world. Chris Watts had confessed. The bodies of his wife and children had been recovered. Now, the justice system would decide his fate. On August 21, 2018, just 6 days after his arrest, Chris Watts was formally charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 3 for Shanann, Bella, and Cece, and 2 additional counts because Bella and Cece were under the age of 12. He was also charged with 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy for the murder of his unborn son, Nico, and 3 counts of tampering with deceased bodies. If convicted, Chris faced the death penalty, a punishment still legal in Colorado at the time. But there was one person who could spare his life. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Rzusek, had already suffered the worst pain imaginable. They had lost their daughter, their grandchildren, their unborn grandson. And now, they had a choice: demand the death penalty for Chris or allow him to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Their answer was swift. They did not want him to die. The Rzuseks made it clear, they did not believe in the death penalty. Chris Watts had taken everything from them, but they refused to let him take their faith, their values. They wanted him to live with what he had done. On November 6, 2018, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for removing the death penalty from consideration. There would be no trial, no more lies, no chance to manipulate the courtroom. Just a swift and final judgment. 13 days later, on November 19, 2018, Chris Watts stood before Judge Marcelo Kopkow as his fate was sealed. Shanann's family was in the courtroom, their grief palpable. Her father, Frank, wept as he listened to the charges being read. Her mother, Sandra, shook as she spoke directly to the man who had destroyed their lives. "We trusted you. You are nothing but a heartless monster," she said. "You took our daughter, our grandchildren, and our grandson. I hope you hear their voices every day and every night." Chris said nothing. He refused to apologize, refused to look at them, refused to acknowledge the devastation he had caused. Then came the final decision. Judge Kopkow sentenced Chris Watts to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 48 additional years for unlawful termination of a pregnancy and 36 years for tampering with deceased bodies. Chris Watts would never be a free man again. For the Rzusek family, the sentencing brought legal closure, but no peace. Their daughter and grandchildren were gone, and the world would not let them grieve in silence. As the case exploded in the media, a darker side of public obsession emerged. Conspiracy theorists flooded the internet, claiming Chris had been framed, that Shanann was abusive, even that she had been the true killer. The lies spread like wildfire across social media, fueled by people who refused to accept the facts. The Rzuseks were bombarded with harassment. They received death threats, hateful messages, and relentless attacks from strangers who had never met Shanann but were determined to rewrite her story. At one point, Sandra Rzusek broke down, pleading for the attacks to stop. "My daughter was a wonderful mother. She loved her children with all her heart. And she died protecting them." But the harassment did not end. The Rzuseks were forced to take legal action, filing lawsuits against those who spread the worst of the conspiracy theories. They won multiple defamation cases, shutting down some of the worst offenders. But the damage had already been done. Meanwhile, Chris Watts' own family struggled with their own reality. His parents, Ronnie and Cindy Watts, initially defended their son. Cindy, in particular, refused to believe that Chris had murdered his daughters. "I just don't see him doing that," she said in an interview. "I just don't see it." Even after his guilty plea, Cindy Watts continued to insist that the full truth had not been revealed. The case tore apart the Watts family, leaving them fractured and broken. Chris had destroyed 2 families, his own and the one he married into. And for what? An affair? A new life? The illusion of freedom? The price had been far too high. The Watts family murders were among the most widely published. The sheer brutality of the case, the murder of a pregnant woman, the deaths of 2 innocent children at the hands of their own father, left the public horrified. News outlets covered every development. True crime enthusiasts dissected every detail. Social media exploded with theories, anger, and heartbreak. Then came the documentaries. In September 2020, Netflix released American Murder, The Family Next Door, a documentary that shocked the world all over again. Unlike traditional crime documentaries, this film used only real footage, Shanann's own social media videos, police body cam footage, interrogation room clips, and text messages. It allowed audiences to see and hear Shanann, Bella, and Cece in their own words, making their loss even more devastating. The documentary painted a clear picture: Chris Watts had never been the victim. He had never been trapped in an unhappy marriage. He had been given every chance to walk away, to divorce, to leave peacefully. But he had chosen murder instead. Public outrage intensified. Why had he done it? Theories ranged from financial stress to his affair to his narcissism. But at the core, one chilling truth remained. Chris Watts had been willing to murder his own children just to escape his responsibilities. Even years after his sentencing, the case continues to haunt the public conscience. Chris Watts remains behind bars, serving his life sentence at Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. He was transferred there from Colorado for his own protection, because even in prison, other inmates despise a man who would kill his own children. He now spends his days in a 6 by 9 foot cell, alone. Shanann's family continues to keep her memory alive. They visit her grave, they share her story, they fight against misinformation. They will never let the world forget what happened. And perhaps, the greatest tragedy of all is that for Bella and Cece, their father had been their hero. He had been the man they looked up to, the one they trusted, the one they loved unconditionally. And in the end, he was the one who took everything from them. Their lives. Their futures. Their voices. Forever silenced by the one man who was supposed to protect them. The case of Chris Watts is one of the most disturbing betrayals ever documented. A father who had everything, a loving wife, 2 beautiful daughters, and a baby boy on the way, chose to destroy it all in the most unforgivable way possible. It forces us to ask some terrifying questions. What drives a person to commit such heinous acts? Was it greed? Was it selfishness? Or was it something even more chilling, a complete lack of empathy? And perhaps the most haunting question of all. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Shanann had no idea that the man she loved was planning to take her life. Bella and Cece never suspected that their hero, their own father, would be the one to betray them. The truth is, domestic violence does not always look the way we expect. It doesn't always come with bruises or raised voices. Sometimes, it's hidden behind smiles, vacations, social media posts, and the illusion of a perfect family. But behind closed doors, the danger is real. If you or someone you know is in a toxic or abusive relationship, please, speak up. Seek help. Pay attention to the warning signs. No one should have to wonder if the person they love might one day become their killer. Now, we want to hear from you. Do you think there were signs that were missed? Was there a moment where this tragedy could have been stopped? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video compelling, help us continue sharing important cases like this. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Most importantly, share this video, because raising awareness could save a life. Thank you for watching Secret in the Dark. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.